On the 4th of November, 1955, in a first-floor office at Buckingham Palace overlooking the forecourt, a 68-year-old man with a clipped gray mustache wrote a letter that ended a love affair he had spent 2 years quietly strangling. His name was Sir Alan Lascelles. The newspapers called him Tommy. He had served King George V, briefly and bitterly served Edward VIII, steadied King George VI through a war, and then guided a 25-year-old queen through her first uncertain years on the throne. He had been in the room, almost always in the room, for every crisis the House of Windsor preferred the public never to see. The abdication of 1936, the secret cancer that killed George VI in 1952, and the romance between Princess Margaret and a divorced group captain named Peter Townsend that Lascelles regarded as a threat to the crown itself. He kept a diary the entire time. In a small, precise hand, he wrote down what the king said, what the queens feared, and what he thought of all of them. He was the most discreet man in England. He was also, it turned out, the most devastating witness it ever produced. To understand him, you have to start with the diary itself, because the diary is the spine of this entire story. It was not one notebook. It was a series of them, written across 40 years, bound in black leather, fitted with silver locks. They were designed for his eyes only. When a biographer once asked about the most sensitive material inside, Lascelles did not refuse to answer. He simply said the contents would not be seen by anyone for 50 years. That single sentence tells you almost everything about the man. He was paid, for most of his adult life, to keep the monarchy's secrets. And every night, in a clear and steady hand, he wrote them down anyway. The published version of those abdication and war journals carries the title King's Counselor, edited by his friend Duff Hart Davis, and it did not reach a bookshop until 2006, a quarter of a century after the man who wrote it was gone. That book is the authority object for everything that follows. Half the people who tell you about the mid-century palace are quietly paraphrasing it. So, who was he? He was born in Dorset in April of 1887, into the minor aristocracy, and educated at Marlborough College and then at Trinity College, Oxford, where he took a degree in the classics. And here the record corrects a small detail that often gets attached to men of his type. He is sometimes placed at Eton. He was not an Eton man. He was Marlborough, then Oxford. The distinction matters only because it tells you he was inside the establishment without being quite at its glittering center, which is exactly the position a great courtier occupies. He was near the throne, but never of it. He served the people at the very top without ever being one of them. And that gap, that half step of distance, is precisely what let him see them so clearly. He came of age into the trenches. He served on the Western Front with the Bedfordshire Yeomanry, rose to the rank of captain, and came home in 1919 with a military cross and the particular flatness of voice that the survivors of that war tended to keep for the rest of their lives. He did not raise his voice afterward. He had seen what loud men did to other men's sons. And that war shaped the courtier he became, because the men who came back from it had a very low tolerance for theater that was not earned. Lascelles believed, all his life, that the monarchy was a kind of performance, that it had to be staged, that the public ceremony mattered, but he also believed the performance could not be a lie. The crown could be a piece of theater. It could not be fake. The man underneath it had to be the genuine article, or the whole thing was a fraud being worked on the public. That single conviction is the key to everything he did next, including the things that made people call him cold. He was not measuring the royals against their charm. He was measuring them against whether they were real. People who worked alongside him found him frightening. He was tall and very lean, stiff-necked, exact. Peter Townsend, who would later have very good reason to resent him, described him as cold, rigid, and inhibited. Others put it more simply. Most people were a little afraid of him. He enforced the rules of the household to the letter, and his own private code of conduct was, in the words of the man who later edited his diaries, severe and unbending. But severity is not the same thing as cruelty, and that distinction is going to matter a great deal before this story is finished. The audience that watches these stories tends to want a villain in a gray suit. The man himself was more complicated than that, and the diaries are the proof. In 1920, he entered royal service for the first time as assistant private secretary to the most glamorous young man in the world, Edward, Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII. And here is where the story turns, because the courtier who would spend his life defending the crown began his career privately deciding that the heir to it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. He watched the prince closely for the better part of a decade. He saw the charm, and he saw what sat underneath the charm. What he saw frightened him. There was one moment that fixed it. In 1927, during the prince's tour of Canada, Lascelles said something to the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, that no loyal servant of the crown was ever supposed to say out loud. He told Baldwin that the heir to the throne was racing toward disaster. And then he said this, and these are his own recorded words. I can't help thinking that the best thing that could happen to him, and to the country, would be for him to break his neck. That is a man, employed to protect a future king, telling the Prime Minister it would be better for everyone if that future king fell off a horse and never got up. And here's the part that has survived in the record and never lost its power to startle. Baldwin did not recoil. Baldwin looked at him and replied, God forgive me, I have often thought the same. Hold on to that exchange, because it explains the next 30 years. Two of the most powerful men in Britain, the King's Secretary and the King's First Minister, had already privately concluded that the future Edward VIII was unfit. They simply could not say it. The machinery of the monarchy depended on the public believing the opposite, on the dashing young prince being exactly the golden future the newspapers sold. And the two men closest to the truth had to keep selling it, smiling at the cameras, while privately agreeing that the country was riding toward a disaster, wearing the face of its most popular man. That is the secret at the heart of the whole interwar monarchy, and Lascelles carried it for the better part of a decade before he decided he could not carry it any longer. So Lascelles did the only honest thing his code permitted. In 1929, he resigned. He walked away from the household of the most popular royal in the world, an almost unheard-of act for a man in his position, a deliberate closing of a golden door. He told the prince, in effect, that he was steering toward the rocks, and he refused to stand on the deck while it happened. Now, here is where the record gets contested, and where we have to be careful, because the easy version of this story turns Lascelles into a snake. Edward himself later called him exactly that snake. And the modern reassessments of him, the careful long reads by writers like Henry Oliver, push back hard against the cartoon. They argue he was not a schemer at all, but a reluctant, principled man who recognized inevitabilities rather than engineering them. The truth is quieter and colder. He despised what Edward was becoming, yes, but he also wept for him. He once described the future king, in a remark recorded by his friend, Harold Nicholson, as like a child in the fairy stories who had been given every gift except a soul. That is not the language of a villain rubbing his hands. That is the language of a man watching something beautiful rot from the inside and being unable to stop it. For a few years, he stepped away from the family entirely. He took a post across the Atlantic as Secretary to the Governor-General of Canada from 1931 to 1935. A kind of dignified exile from the household that had exhausted him. But the crown has a long reach, and men like Lascelles do not stay away. In the closing months of 1935, he came back into royal service, this time at the side of the old king, George V, as assistant private secretary. And here, the timing turns almost cruel. George V died in January of 1936. The throne passed to the very man Lascelles had warned about for 15 years. Edward VIII was now king, and Lascelles was, briefly and technically, his servant again. Though in that strange, short reign, he barely saw him. The new king had little use for the household his father had built. He was already looking elsewhere, toward a woman the establishment could not accept. And in December of 1936, the thing Lascelles had foreseen in Canada 9 years earlier came true. Edward VIII abdicated the throne to marry a twice-divorced American, Wallis Simpson, after a reign of less than a year. And here's the part the popular story gets wrong. Lascelles was not triumphant. By his own account, he was stunned. The evening he learned it would actually happen, he could not sit still in the palace. He went out into the December dark and walked 3 times around St. James's Park, thinking, he wrote, of James II, the last British king to lose his throne and flee. He called the abdication, in the end, a real tragedy in his life. The man who had wished the heir would break his neck grieved when the heir finally fell. The country, he believed, was better off without him. That did not make it painless. Both things were true at once, and Lascelles was honest enough, in private, to hold them both. There was only one problem with the king who replaced Edward. He had never wanted the job, and he was not built for it. George VI was a shy, stammering man, thrust onto a throne he had spent his whole life assuming would never be his. And it fell to Lascelles, promoted to private secretary in 1943, the most senior courtier of all, to steady him through the worst years Britain had faced in centuries. Through the Blitz, through the long uncertainty of the war, through every speech the king dreaded giving and gave anyway. What the public saw was a brave, dutiful monarch in uniform. What Lascelles saw up close was the cost of it. The exhaustion, the nerves, the human being underneath the crown. And in his diary, he recorded a respect for George VI that he had never once felt for the brother. Here was a man, honest and dutiful, doing a job he hated because the country needed him to. Lascelles spent the war beside him, and he kept his diary the entire time, the most candid record of the British monarchy at war that anyone has ever produced. And he locked it away. Then came the secret that opens this channel's biggest story. In the autumn of 1951, the king's health collapsed. On the 23rd of September that year, surgeons performed a major operation, the complete removal of his left lung. The man who did it was a thoracic surgeon named Clement Price Thomas, and the public was told almost nothing true about it. The official bulletin spoke only of structural changes in the lung. The word that the surgeons were actually treating, cancer, appeared in no announcement. The malignancy was concealed from the press, from the nation, and, by most accounts, from the king himself. But the household knew. The men at the center of the palace knew what the structural changes really were. Lascelles knew. And so he spent the final months of George VI's life carrying a piece of knowledge that the king's own subjects were not permitted to have, that the man on the throne was dying. Picture what that requires. You stand in the room, you arrange the audiences, you draft the correspondence, you keep the machine of monarchy turning, and the whole time you are holding a death sentence behind your teeth, because discretion is the entire job. Think about what that actually cost a person, day after day. This was a king Lascelles had come to genuinely admire, the reluctant monarch who had done the hard, frightening work without complaint, the honest man who had earned the respect the brother never did. And now, Lascelles had to watch him fade, in public, while the nation was told a softer story. He had to draft the cheerful bulletins. He had to manage the appearances. He had to keep the secret of the king's own body from the king's own people, and very possibly help keep it from the king himself, because that was what the institution required, and the institution always came first. He had spent his whole career arguing that the monarchy could be staged but could not be fake, and here he was, staging the final act of a dying man's reign. Whatever you think of that, and people argue about it still, about whether a man has the right to be told he is dying, it was the heaviest discretion of his life, and he carried it the way he carried everything, without raising his voice and without letting a single subject see the weight. On the 6th of February, 1952, George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham. A 25-year-old woman in Kenya became Queen Elizabeth II, and the man who had to manage all of it, who had carried the secret to the end, was the same gray courtier who had once told Baldwin that her uncle should break his neck. He had now served 4 monarchs. There was one crisis left. Her name was Margaret, and the trouble was a man named Peter Townsend. Townsend was a group captain in the Royal Air Force, a decorated wartime pilot, handsome and gentle and married, and then, by the early 1950s, divorced. He had served the royal household as an equerry, close to the family, trusted inside the walls. And Princess Margaret, the late king's younger daughter, the queen's only sister, had fallen in love with him. The household first understood how serious it was at the coronation in June of 1953, when a watching press corps caught Margaret brushing a piece of lint from Townsend's uniform with the easy intimacy of a woman who belonged to him. It was a tiny gesture. It told the whole story, and the newspapers, suddenly, had it. For Lascelles, this was impossible, and he said so without softening it. Townsend was divorced, Margaret was third in line to the throne, and the sister of the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a church that did not then countenance the remarriage of a divorced person whose former spouse still lived. To Lascelles, this was not a matter of feeling. It was a matter of what the institution could survive. He had spent his life keeping the monarchy real in the eyes of the public, and a royal princess marrying a divorced man, against the church her own family headed, struck him as exactly the kind of crack through which the whole thing could be lost. He had watched one royal romance, Edward and Wallis, tear a king off the throne inside a single year. He was not going to stand by for a second. When Townsend told him plainly that he meant to marry her, Lascelles, by several accounts, told him to his face that he must be mad or bad. And then he did the thing he is most remembered and most blamed for. He arranged for Townsend to be posted abroad, sent to Brussels as an air attaché at the British Embassy, framed as a career posting, functioning in reality as an exile. Distance, Lascelles calculated, would do the work that argument could not. Send the man to another country, let the months stretch out, let the press lose interest and the heat go out of it, and the problem might solve itself without anyone having to forbid anything in public. It was a courtier's solution, quiet, deniable, and patient. There was only one problem. It worked. Now we have to be precise here, because this is the single most contested point in the whole story, and the honest answer is that the record is divided. It is tempting to say Lascelles ended the romance single-handedly, the hand on the scale, the cold courtier who broke a princess's heart on principle. The audience feels it. It is the version that lands. But it is not quite what the evidence will bear. Yes, he opposed the match. Yes, he advised the Queen and the government against it. Yes, he engineered the physical distance, the Brussels posting, that helped doom it. But the marriage faced a wall that no single courtier had built. There was the old Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required the sovereign's consent. There was the Church's settled position. There was a cabinet unwilling to legislate a way around it. And there was the plain arithmetic of what Margaret herself would lose: her rank, her income, her place. The editor of Lascelles' diaries is cautious on exactly how decisive he personally was. Anne Glenconner, Margaret's lady-in-waiting, who wrote about the affair from the princess's side in her memoir, Lady-in-Waiting, casts the whole establishment, not one man, as the force that took Townsend away. So we will say what the record supports, and no more. Lascelles opposed the marriage, shaped how it was handled, and built the distance between them. Whether he ended it, or whether it was already over the moment a divorced man fell in love with a princess of that church, in that decade, that remains genuinely disputed. Margaret blamed him. She is said to have told friends she would curse him to her grave. The arithmetic finished the work the courtier had started. When Townsend came back to London in 1955, Margaret had turned 25 and no longer strictly needed her sister's permission, but she still faced losing nearly everything that made her who she was. On the 31st of October, 1955, she ended it publicly, in a statement that spoke of the Church's teaching and her duty to the Commonwealth. Townsend himself, writing his own memoir more than 20 years later, put it without bitterness and without illusion. She could have married him, he wrote, only if she had been prepared to give up everything, her position, her prestige, her privy purse. He knew, he said, that he had not the weight to counterbalance all that she would have lost. The audience that watches these stories tends to say, Margaret chose status over love. Townsend, the man who lost her, understood it better than that. She did not so much choose status as discover how much it would cost to leave it. And the man whose job it was to make that cost visible, to keep it in front of her, was the gray figure at the first-floor window. Then Lascelles went home. At the end of 1953, he had already retired from the Queen's service, and he lived on quietly for nearly 30 more years, in a grace-and-favor apartment at Kensington Palace, the institution's secrets locked in black leather behind silver clasps. He never gave an interview that mattered. When someone suggested he go on television to discuss the future of the monarchy, he said he would as soon walk stark naked down Piccadilly. He had spent his life being unseen, and he intended to stay that way. He had been keeper of the Royal Archives, the man entrusted with the institution's official memory, and the whole time he had been keeping a private archive of his own, a counter-record that answered to no one but himself. He died on the 10th of August, 1981, at Kensington Palace, 94 years old. And here the record corrects one last detail of the legend, gently, because the truth is sharper than the myth. The story is that he took his secrets to his grave. He did not, in fact, leave a grave to take them to. He wanted no memorial. His ashes were scattered, and there is no stone anywhere with his name on it. What he left instead was the diary. The men and women he had bowed to were gone. The kings whose secrets he had carried were dead. And the notebooks, with their silver locks, waited. They began to open in the 1980s and finished in 2006, when King's Counselor reached the public at last. And the shock of it was this. The most loyal servant the crown ever had, the man who had spent 40 years keeping its secrets, had left behind the most candid record of its failings that anyone had ever written. He had judged them all. He set down what he thought of Edward VIII in lines that no obituary would have dared print, calling him, in the cold language of the diary, a remarkably self-willed man with no conception of general principles, a man of strong primitive passions, and not much else. He recorded the war, and the dying king, and the broken princess, in a hand that never trembled and never flattered. And here is the strange, very human thing about those notebooks. They are not the work of a monster. The same diary that contains those devastating verdicts also contains a man complaining in wartime that his suit had been cut without enough pockets because of rationing. It contains a line, late in his life, noting that the leaf-sweeping season was upon him, and he could no longer rake for very long at a time, that winter was drawing on. He could swing in a single page from the fate of the monarchy to the falling of the leaves, the vast and the small set down with the same unbothered precision. That is what the most discreet man in England was actually like when no one was watching. Not a schemer rubbing his hands. A tired, exact, observant man, raking his garden, writing it all down. And running under all of it, page after page, was a private verdict on the institution he served more faithfully than anyone. A verdict that came off far harder than anything the public was ever allowed to see. The man who spent his life refusing to walk naked down Piccadilly had, in the end, undressed the whole institution, but only after everyone in it, including himself, was safely gone. Tommy Lascelles bowed to 4 monarchs and buried their secrets for 40 years. He never gave an interview. He never wrote a memoir for money. He simply went home each night and, in a small, clear hand, told the truth to a notebook. When that notebook was finally opened, a quarter of a century after his death, it turned out the most discreet man in England had been keeping score the entire time, and the crown he served so faithfully came off far worse than he ever let the public see.